Welcome to the October update. Today, we'll be taking a look at what games are coming to the PlayStation Vita this month, as well as recapping all the most recent Vita-related news stories. I guess we should begin this video by addressing the elephant in the room. The biggest news story this month comes to us by way of Sony Interactive Entertainment Senior VP Hiroyuki Oda, who has announced that manufacturing of the Vita in Japan will at last end in 2019. Mr. Oda's statement reads as follows, quote, "In Japan, we will manufacture PlayStation Vita until 2019. From there, shipping will end," close quote. Given how the Vita's performance in Japan has historically trumped its success in other regions, it's safe to assume that production of the system will also end in the US, Europe, and other territories next year as well. To add fuel to the fire, Oda also confirmed that Sony currently has no plans for a sequel to the Vita, saying, quote, "Currently, we do not have any plans regarding a new handheld device," close quote. Since 2011, the Vita has sold roughly 16 million units worldwide, a far cry from that of its predecessor, the PSP, which eventually reached sales of over 80 million. Despite its poor sales, however, the Vita has always retained a largely devoted and passionate player base, with, until just recently, the system boasting a bigger install base in Japan than even the PS4. In more uplifting news, the Vita can now be overclocked to push the system's CPU to 500 MHz, a process which can be done through the use of the Vita's LOL icon plugin. To put that into perspective, the Vita's default CPU is clocked at 333 MHz, which can be boosted to 444 MHz with Wi-Fi turned off. Once overclocked, many Vita games will now run noticeably better. The improvement is more apparent in certain Vita games than others. For instance, while The Wolf Among Us enjoys quicker load times, fewer hitches, and an overall improvement in performance, Killzone Mercenary sees no noticeable upgrade whatsoever. Meanwhile, although certain open-world titles like Assassin's Creed 3, Liberation, and Borderlands 2 may benefit from slightly more steady frame rates, the improvement here is more or less negligible. It's worth noting that overclocking your Vita does open up the system to certain risks, such as overheating and freezes. Furthermore, it has the potential to shorten the life of your Vita's motherboard. Those willing to risk these potential problems, however, will effectively be getting a free system upgrade. A PS Vita Pro, if you will. The laying off of 90% of Telltale Games' staff last month essentially confirmed what we'd all long ago assumed to be true. None of the Telltale games announced for Vita back at E3 2014, those being Tales from the Borderlands, Minecraft Story Mode, and Game of Thrones, will ever launch on Vita. My thoughts go out to those who were laid off, and I sincerely hope they find new accommodations soon. Lastly, the Vita received a new system update last month in the form of firmware update version 3.69, which simply improves system performance. In all likelihood, this may just be Sony trying to get ahead of any exploits introduced with the last update. Before showcasing our first game, I'd like to quickly mention two interesting games that missed last month's update due to being announced too late to make it into the video. First off, we have Time Spinner, a 2D Metroidvania that follows a young woman traveling through time in an effort to avenge her family from an evil empire. The game's namesake comes from its time stop ability, which allows the player to freeze all nearby enemies at the cost of sand. Over the course of the game, the player will also collect several equipable orbs, each of which boasts its own unique melee and spell attack. With 2 melee orbs being equipable at any one time, Time Spinner features a wide range of combat possibilities to play around with. While the game's beautiful visuals, inventive gameplay mechanics, and intricate story make this a potential Vita Game of the Year contender, reports of several issues plaguing the handheld version of Time Spinner makes me wary of recommending it on Vita. Those interested in the title can always buy and play it on PS4, which in turn will also net you the Vita version for free. The game is available in both the US and Europe. The other game I'd like to shed a light on is Revenant Dogma, a fantasy RPG with turn-based 3D battles. In typical RPG fashion, you're free to explore dynamic dungeons, partake in side quests, and develop new skills as you advance through the game's story. If you're a fan of old-school RPGs and live in the US, then you can pick up Revenant Dogma now. And with those titles out of the way, let's move on to October's new releases. First off is Punchline, a game I covered last month that is now getting a US release. In essence, this is a visual novel adventure game in which you control a ghost and haunt a house through a range of different abilities. Punchline releases in the US both digitally and at retail on October 9th. Next up we have Chicken Range, a game I couldn't actually find any footage of. This is a shoot 'em up in which the player uses an array of different weaponry to shoot chickens. The game spans 8 levels, with each new stage introducing new chicken foes to hunt down. The player can carry up to 6 weapons at once, with more tools of destruction being available to purchase in-game. Chicken Range releases digitally in both the US and Europe on October 26th. Our next game is Deathmark, a horror visual novel in which you assume the role of a character suffering from amnesia, who awakens to find themselves bearing the mark, which is said to bring about death. As such, you enter a mysterious house in hopes of avoiding your fate, fending off ghosts and finding clues as you progress through the story. Outside of Resident Evil Revelations 2 and Lone Survivor, the Vita's never really been home to many solid horror games. Here's hoping Deathmark can buck that trend when it launches both digitally and at retail in the US, Europe, and Japan on October 31st. It's also worth noting that a $60 limited edition of the game is also available for collectors in the US. Lastly, online retailer PlayAsia has announced a physical limited edition of Stay, a real-time pixel adventure game that launched on Vita last month. The less said about Stay's intriguing narrative, the better. This is a story you'll likely want to go into knowing nothing about. This new edition of the game comes with the game's original soundtrack, a numbered certificate, and a 48-page booklet loaded with concept art and hints. No concrete release date for Stay's limited edition has been set as of yet. Which brings us to the end of this month's update. It's worth noting that these aren't all the Vita games releasing this month, just the ones I decided to showcase. For a list of all the new Vita games not mentioned in this video, see the description box below. While last month may have set in stone the Vita's inevitable end, it also once again showcased the ingenuity of its player base, with the ability to now overclock your Vita. It's important to bear in mind that while the Vita may be nearing the finish line, there are still many new games coming to the system for well into the foreseeable future. As long as new Vita games are on the horizon, the updates shall continue. As always, thank you all so much for tuning in. Until next time, this has been Fixation.